Hello and welcome to this tutorial, and in this tutorial we are going to discuss the other issues which we are going to face while developing the Android applications. So one issue which I have faced by using the Android Studio 1.5 is that it has layout rendering problems. So whenever we start a new Android Studio project, sometimes what happens is that the layout is not rendered, and we have a problem which is called as layout rendering problem, wherein if you have a preview of your activity, it is actually going to not display anything on your activity. So that's basically a layout rendering problem, and we are going to discuss the issues, or we are going to discuss the solution to basically resolve the rendering issue. So the very first thing which we could do in this case is that basically rebuild the project. So basically if you go to the toolbar, there is always an option for rebuilding the project. So if we click rebuild project, sometimes it might solve your issue. So the next solution for this is restarting Android Studio. So if you are having rendering problems, and if you have rebuilt the project and still if the problem persists, so in that case what I would recommend is that you restart Android Studio, and this is the solution which I use every time. So basically whenever I am trying to use Android Studio, I create a new project, and when I have the rendering problem, I directly close Android Studio and restart it again, and the problem is basically solved. Now I don't know the exact reason why this happens, and I hope that Android actually fixes this in the next version of the Android Studio. So I hope that if you download a version of Android Studio which is greater than 1.5, so I hope that you don't have a problem over there, so we don't have rendering problem in the newer versions. So this is the second method which I use. Now the third one is that sometimes what happens is that our project has some compiled dependencies which we have not yet added. So if we take an example of the card view tutorial which we have in this course, so even before creating a card view, what we need to do is that we need to add up a compiled dependency to our project so as to basically avoid rendering problems. So if you have not yet added the dependency for each and every element, before adding the element you might face rendering problems. So the previous version of the Android Studio has a problem wherein you could not add the navigation drawer without adding the compiled dependency, but in this version, which is 1.5, we could directly add in the navigation drawer even without adding a compiled dependency to it. So make sure that you look into these three things if you have rendering problems, and your rendering problems should be solved. So restarting Android Studio is the best method to basically get rid of rendering problems. So you will be able to render the preview of your application or the preview of your activity if you follow these three steps. Now the next issue which many of us face is that as soon as we try to add an image into our application crashes. So basically, let's say you want to create an application wherein you have multiple images. So what we try to do here is that we try to import images into Android Studio by simply copying them into drawable folder, and when we create an image view and when we add the images to the image view, and if we save the code and if we run the application on either emulator or the device, our application completely crashes. So there could be a number of reasons for why this happens. So we are going to discuss one by one why this thing happens and how actually to solve it. So the very first thing which I would recommend you is that you always upload the images which are present in the PNG format. So whenever you are downloading some images on internet, or if you are creating the images of your own in Photoshop, so always store the images in the PNG format and always import them into Android Studio in the PNG format. And that is because if you use a JPEG format, sometimes your application is going to crash. So PNG format is the safest format whenever you want to download or whenever you want to import images into Android Studio. And if you want to use them, always make sure that the images are actually present in the PNG format. So this is one of the methods to get rid of errors associated with images. Now one more issue which we have in Android is that sometimes we cannot actually, let's say, upload high resolution images, and sometimes it causes an application to crash. So let's say you want to display an HD image into your application, and there is a certain size limit up to which we could upload the images, and if we exceed that size limit, then chances are our application is going to load up a bit slow, or it is basically going to crash. So in order to avoid this issue, what we could do is that we either use a low resolution image, or what we could do is that there are multiple programs present on the internet which are basically used to reduce the size of the image or to compress the image without compromising on the quality. So I would recommend you to use these tools and convert your image into a lower size image if you want to use high resolution images in your application. Now the next thing which I recommend is that give appropriate path to your images. So let's say you have multiple images, so instead of pasting them all in the drawable folder, what I would recommend is that inside the drawable folder create a folder for each set of image. So that is going to basically save you a lot of time, and your project is going to get organized in a much more proper fashion. So instead of directly specifying drawable, what you could do is that while specifying the image path, you could type at drawable slash the name of the folder in which your image is located slash your image name.png or your image name. So that is basically going to make your project much more organized, and it would be easier for you to identify which image is present in which folder. And the final thing which I would recommend you, when you are working with images, never add numbers as names to your image. So let's say if you're having multiple images, then it's a habit to basically name the images as image 1, image 2, image 3. And what I recommend is that if you want to add numbers to your images, you add it in alphabetical fashion. Like if you want to add 1 to your image name, so instead of just typing in 1 as a number, you type in the number as a word. And that is because whenever we add numbers to the images, sometimes the application crashes. So make sure that you don't add numbers to the image names, and that is going to basically avoid you from getting errors in your application. Now the next error which most of us face is that the application won't work on a device. So basically, let's say you have created an application, it runs fine on the emulator, and basically when you try to import the application, or if you create an APK for the application, and if you try to run this application on your device, the application actually does not install, or it crashes upon opening the application. So we are going to learn how to basically get rid of this issue. So the very first thing which we do is that we check the device version. So chances are you might be using a very old version of Android, and your emulator might be of a relatively new version. So what happens is that some of the components which we use in our application are actually the latest component, which won't actually run on the older device. So basically make sure that your device is not too old for the application to actually run, and always try to compare the version of the emulator which you are using in Android Studio and the version of your device. And if there is a drastic difference in between these two, then chances are your application might not run on the device. The second thing would be you check your minimum SDK version. So minimum SDK version is the version which we basically set on creating a new project, and the minimum SDK version which we have used in this entire course is nothing but the API level 15. Each and every device which is below API level 15, chances are that our application won't run in your device. So basically, in order to make your application function on each and every device, make sure that you choose the lowest API level. But there is also a disadvantage of choosing the lowest API level, and that disadvantage is basically you cannot run, or you cannot use many of the new features which are added to Android. So that was the second point, check your minimum SDK version. And I think the most optimal version at this point, at this time, is basically the API level 15 for ice cream sandwich. So if we go with the API level 15, chances are our application works on most of the devices. And also the third problem is that some latest components may not work on old device. So for example, when we try to use the latest components which are added by Android in the newer versions, so if we include these components in our Android application, and if we try to run this thing or this application on the older device, then chances are it might not work. So while adding up components, make sure that these components are actually functional on the older device, because you want to actually make your application works on maximum devices possible. So depending upon your target audience, if your audience is basically using older version phones, so make sure that your application is basically compatible with their devices. Now, the next error which we face while developing applications is sometimes what happens when we open up Android Studio and we already have a project which we have created previously. Sometimes what happens is that the R alphabet which we use in our application, like while having a reference to something, we have the red line under the R and the R actually appears to be red. So basically it shows that the symbol R cannot be resolved. So I don't know why this happens technically, but I tried to find a solution to it, and the most effective way of getting rid of this thing is that we rebuild a project. So basically when we click the rebuild button on our Android Studio, it is basically going to rebuild the entire project and we will get rid of this error. Now even if this does not work, the next step would be to sync the project. Now the button for syncing the project is available on the interface of the Android Studio. So if you find the button for the sync project, you simply click on it and this should solve your issue. Now the final thing which we do is that even after rebuilding the project, even after syncing the project, your error is not resolved, then the final thing which you could do is that you could simply restart Android Studio. So after applying these 3 steps, I am sure that your error would be resolved. So this was basic error resolving for this R unresolved symbol. Now the next thing which we are going to discuss is the navigation drawer not working on device. So basically if you try to run the Pizza application on many of the devices, it is not going to run, and the reason for that is we have basically used the inbuilt navigation drawer, and the inbuilt navigation drawer may cause problems on some of the old devices. So basically what I would recommend you is that you don't use navigation drawer if you want to actually develop an application for a large number of audience by using the inbuilt thing. So basically there is also a method for creating a navigation drawer without using the inbuilt functionality, but if you are using it for learning purposes, then there is no issue with it at all. And also I have tested this navigation drawer which is inbuilt on many of the devices, and I found that it actually works on Lollipop, it works on Marshmallow, but when I try to run this navigation drawer application on my KitKat device, it actually crashes the application when we try to run it. Make sure that you are either using a newer version of Android phone, or if you actually want to target the audience which has a version lower than Lollipop, so if they use a KitKat version, so chances are this might not work on their device. So you make the changes accordingly in your Android application. Now the next error is that we are not able to use card view. So the reason that card view does not work on your phone is that the same reason that your phone is a little bit older version, and it might not work on your phone. But even if your phone is new and if your card view is not working, then the reasons are that you have not yet added the appropriate compiled dependency for the card view. So even before creating a card view for our application, what we need to do is that we need to add a dependency for a card view, and I have also mentioned how to basically add up a dependency so that you could add the card view to the device, or to add a card view to your application. So basically make sure that you follow these steps which are mentioned in this course one by one, and even if you miss a single step, you might actually face a problem later. So make sure that you pay close attention to each and every step and follow accordingly. Now after adding compiled dependency, what happens is that your project is automatically going to sync up, but in case the project is not automatically syncing up, we actually need to physically sync the project after adding the dependencies so that the Gradle files are synced up with the application files. So once you have added the dependency, make sure that you sync up the project, and after doing this your card view should work. So that's it for this tutorial, and I hope you guys understood how to basically resolve multiple issues which arise while developing Android applications. So thank you very much for watching this tutorial, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Thank you.